Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Liz Woodruff, the Executive Director of the Idaho Academy of Family Physicians. Thank you for joining us for Cultivating Resilience, Why Lifestyle is the Best Medicine with Dr. Meagan Grega. Before we begin the formal presentation, I want to cover some logistics. First, please make sure you are in mute when not speaking. This will reduce background noise during the presentation. You are invited to turn on closed captioning if that is helpful to you. You may ask questions via the chat box during the presentation. You can also unmute yourself when prompted and ask your question directly at the conclusion of the full presentation. But you can put your questions in the chat throughout and we will get to them near the end. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and we plan to end on time. But if your question isn't answered, I know Dr. Grega has indicated that she's willing to stick around to answer some questions. At the webinar's conclusion, I'll share a link to a quick survey to evaluate the webinar. I'll also send this to you via email. Please take a few minutes to provide your feedback. You will receive a CME certificate for this webinar over email within the next two weeks. And we do hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming educational content. We have a lot of great content planned. This is the first in our summer fall evening CME series. It culminates with a KSA on care of women on October 7th. And shortly I'll be dropping those registration links into the chat for you to save for after the presentation. Not wanting to distract you, but I do want to make sure that you get that information. Meagan Grega, MD, is the co-founder and chief medical officer of Kellen Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to making the healthy choice the easy choice. Kellen provides school-based healthy lifestyle education and garden as classroom programs, supports access to nutrient-dense produce and delicious plant-powered prepared meals via the Eat Real Foods mobile market, engages participants in hands-on plant-based cooking classes in community settings, and offers intensive therapeutic lifestyle change interventions for individuals and families. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Bucknell University with a BS in biochemistry, cell biology, and earned her MD from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Dr. Grega spent several years as a medical officer in the United States Navy, attaining the rank of lieutenant commander before resigning from active duty. She has been a staff family physician at Hunterton Medical Center, the director of women's health services at Lafayette College, and is currently the managing director of Ilianest Retreat and Wellness Center. I'll let her correct the pronunciation of that if needed, the home of the Kellen Foundation. Dr. Grega, we're really pleased to have you here. Thanks so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you to share your presentation and begin.
Thank you so much, Liz. And it's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for inviting me to come hang out with you on this summer Thursday. I know everybody has a lot of great stuff going on. So let's start by sharing the screen and we'll jump right in to talking about cultivating resilience and why lifestyle is the best medicine. So as Liz mentioned, I am Dr. Meagan Grega. I am also a family doc, just like you guys, and I'm board certified in both family medicine and lifestyle medicine, and have been doing a lot of the things with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine over the last couple of years. And along those lines, I would say that lifestyle medicine and family medicine are very, very similar. There are things that we as family docs are trained to do, things that we want to do. The question is, how do we implement this really into our practice, and how can we motivate patients so that they're able to take advantage of lifestyle, which is really the best medicine? So in addition to being the co-founder and chief medical officer of Kellen, I also am faculty for family medicine and an internal medicine residency program. And I also teach for the Temple St. Luke's Medical School. So trying to inspire the doctors of the future to be able to be doing this with lifestyle medicine is, I think, another really important piece. I have nothing to disclose. And as far as our learning objectives for today, what we are going to be looking at is describing the relationships between lifestyle choices and chronic disease, and also summarizing the research regarding common characteristics of communities with higher than average percentages of octogenarians and older inhabitants. So when you think about where people are living the longest and living the best, what is it that they are doing that, that maybe we can replicate for ourselves as well? Now, Thomas Edison, a really long time ago, said the doctor of the future will give no medication, but will interest his patients in the care of the human frame, diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. Now, Thomas Edison wasn't a doctor, but I often think that he might have been one of the first lifestyle medicine pioneers because he was really focusing on the importance of how we take care of ourselves, our lifestyle choices every day. And though we have not reached this future yet, and I don't think we ever will, it's very important for us to be able to use the medications that we have and the procedures that we have when that's applicable. But I do think it highlights for us why it's so important to focus on the root causes of disease as well, and helping our patients impact that. So this picture really, for me, shows the type of healthy aging that I would like to have, and what we would really like to have for our patients, where you're getting older but still with vitality and purpose and connection, able to do the things that you want to do with your family and friends as you're getting into your older years. So if this is our goal, how are we doing with that here in this country? And unfortunately, we are spending a lot of money kind of going after that goal. So if you look at how much money we spend in the United States per person in 2021, it was almost $13,000 per person in healthcare costs. And that would be reasonable if we were getting a good return on investment. If we're able to afford it, and if it's working out well for us, why not? But unfortunately, we are definitely not getting a good return on investment for that amount of money, because when you look at our life expectancy at birth, we are actually 3 years lower than the average of our kind of comparison nations. So places like Australia and France and Germany. So we're spending a lot of money, but we're really not necessarily seeing the outcome that we want, which is longevity, but even more importantly, healthy longevity. There's been talk of something called the marginal decade, the last 10 years of your life, and that it's a time that you're not really able to enjoy as much of the things that you used to before. And also a time when maybe you're suffering from a lot of different chronic disease or things like that. What we would love to do is to be able to expand both our lifespan and our health span. So be able to have as much vitality and quality of life until very much near the end of our life. And unfortunately, that's not how we're doing things currently in the United States. But there are places in the world that are being more successful with that. And we're going to take a look at some of those places too. The life expectancy and mortality rates in the United States have actually, life expectancy wise, have actually been going down for a while, even before the pandemic. So in the beginning of I should say at the end of the 20th and at the beginning of the 21st century, life expectancy in the US was increasing for most of that time, but the trajectory kind of slowed, and then life expectancy started decreasing after 2014. Part of that is because of things like drug overdoses and suicide and kind of deaths of despair. But a lot of it also had to do with organ system diseases in young and middle-aged adults. So things like diabetes and heart disease at much younger ages. And so what that sort of says to me is we kind of had a good run for a while where we were improving life expectancy with things like our medications and more screenings and procedures. But we've kind of hit the ceiling of that at this point. And even though we're going to still be using those sort of medications to treat diabetes or heart disease, we have to look more at the underlying causes, because we are actually seeing life expectancy go down in the United States. And the United States is also the most likely to have multiple chronic conditions in our adult population. So if you look at our reference nations, the United States has more older adults, or just adults, actually, I should just say age 18 and older, that have multiple chronic diseases, which kind of goes along with why we're spending so much on our healthcare, but also why we're not having much of an impact as far as our longevity. If you look at this infographic from Robert Wood Johnson, it looks at what really is the impact of different parts of our social system and our healthcare system as far as things like mortality and morbidity. Because, here in the United States, we've got really good clinical care. We've got some good hospitals. We have great clinicians, great doctors and nurses. We have access to a lot of imaging studies and medications that maybe other parts of the world don't have. But as it turns out, clinical care, that quality that we were talking about of the healthcare facilities and clinicians that you can access, really only adds up to about 20% of the impact for things like mortality or morbidity. Other things like our own health behaviors and the social and economic factors that are surrounding us, as well as the impact of our physical environment, actually have more of an impact. That's the kind of the 80% when you add all that up together. So obviously, it's really important to have great clinical care and have access to wonderful doctors and nurses and healthcare facilities. But if we don't look at that other 80%, we're going to have a hard time really making an impact and moving the needle as far as improving people's longevity, vitality, and quality of life. So if you look at the top 10 causes of mortality from 2021, the things that are most likely to kill all Americans, 8 out of that 10, so the ones I've highlighted here in red, have a direct relationship as far as risk with our lifestyle choices. So if you look at things like heart disease and diabetes and stroke and Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of impact as far as what our lifestyle choices are on whether or not we get these diseases, and also how significant those diseases are as far as impacting our life. And a lot of times people say, well, you know, it ran in my family. My parents had diabetes, my grandparents had diabetes. Of course, I'm going to get diabetes or heart disease or hypertension, any of those things. But it turns out that only about 20 to 35% of the variation in human lifespan, and also like how healthy we are during that lifespan, is really determined by our genes. You know, our DNA is not our destiny as it once was thought to be. And the majority of what happens to us is really related to our lifestyle behaviors and exposures, that concept of epigenetics, that different genes are turned on or turned off based on what sort of behaviors and exposures we're having. And that is what lifestyle medicine is all about. So it's all about how do we maximize and optimize these lifestyle habits so that we can also optimize our health. So lifestyle medicine is the evidence-based, and that's a key piece of the definition. So evidence-based practice of helping individuals and communities, because yes, dealing with that individual in your office is very important, but what the community surrounding that individual, the family and the neighborhood and the social support, is also very, very impactful. So helping to help individuals and communities with these lifestyle changes, comprehensive lifestyle changes that can help prevent, treat, and even potentially reverse the progression of chronic disease by addressing the underlying causes. So not just looking at the symptoms, but addressing the underlying cause. So lifestyle medicine has 6 pillars that we look at. These are the lifestyle habits or the behaviors that we're most focused on. One is what we eat, and that would be a predominantly whole food plant-based diet. That does not mean vegan. I really try to stay away from the V word, because vegan really just tells you what you're not eating. It says you're not eating any animal products. And there may be reasons why people choose to do that. But as far as telling you how healthy the diet is, vegan is not really helpful to give you a quality of what the diet is. Because after all, soda is vegan, potato chips are vegan, French fries are as well, sugary breakfast cereals are vegan. So I like the term whole food plant-based, because that really talks more about what you are eating as opposed to what you're avoiding. And it doesn't have to be all plants. You know, it doesn't have to be completely no animal products at all. Some of the places that we're going to look at in the world that have the longest living inhabitants, they're still having some meat or dairy or fish, but they're having a predominantly unprocessed or minimally processed plant-based diet. So what are we eating? That's one of our pillars. Then physical activity, making sure that we're getting enough of that throughout the day. How do we manage stress? Like, what are our healthy habits for managing stress? How's the strength of our relationships? And then making sure to prioritize restorative sleep, and also tobacco cessation and minimizing excessive amounts of alcohol. So when you look at the places in the world where people live the longest, and when you look at these different places, it has the highest concentration of centenarians on the planet. So in the United States, if you thought about how many centenarians per 100,000 people, if you thought of that as 1, if you look in places like Okinawa or Sardinia, there's 10 times the number of centenarians in those places based on population. So Okinawa is a place in Japan where the world's longest lived women are. And then there's Sardinia, Italy, which is a place where the world's longest lived men are found. Then there's Ikaria, Greece, which is also known as the island where they forget to die. So if you have some vacation time, I think that's a great place to go visit. I would love to see Ikaria one of these days. There's also a blue zone in Nicoya, Costa Rica. And believe it or not, we have one in Loma Linda, California. So there's actually a United States blue zone, but it is not the entire city or area of Loma Linda. It's actually just the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda, California. And so in these areas, these blue zones, people live not only long lives, but they also live really healthy lives for a long time. Like they do not seem to have that marginal decade that we were talking about is so common in the United States. They really end up being independent and active well into their octogenarian and even centenarian years, even though these are mostly places, other than the one in the United States, where they don't have access to the type of healthcare that we kind of take for granted or expect to have in the United States. So what's going on with them? And it turns out that it's really actually when the blue zones were first discovered, National Geographic sent a research team to try to figure out what is going on. Like, is it something in the water, or like, is it something they're eating? Is it something that we could, maybe turn into a nutraceutical and work for, or send it out so that it could be used for the rest of the world? But it turned out it's not just one thing. It's their lifestyle habits. It's the way they have the rhythm of their whole life. And it's very similar to the 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine. It has to do with what they eat, how they move throughout the day, what their sense of purpose and outlook and kind of social connections are, and also how they manage stress. So when you look at the blue zones, you can see what can happen to an entire population if the lifestyle habits are shifted towards these more health promoting options. And to give you an idea of how much of a boost in longevity that might give, this is an example of life expectancy rates for the American blue zone. So for the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda. So if we compare, that at least helps us kind of compare apples to apples here, as opposed to comparing United States rates to someplace like Okinawa. But if you look at women in the United States, and this data was all before the pandemic. So if you look at women in the United States, their life expectancy, that's the purple bar here, was about 81 years. But then if you look at California women, because the Seventh-day Adventist community at Loma Linda is in California, if you look at that, just moving to California helps you out. That gets you to a life expectancy of 83 years as a woman. But if you identified as an Adventist, that gets you up to 87.6. And if you identify as a vegetarian Adventist, so somebody who is really focusing more on the fruits and the vegetables, the whole grains, the beans, nuts and seeds, and maybe just a little bit of dairy or eggs, that gets you up to 89.1. So that's like 8 extra years of healthy life expectancy compared to the general adult population, female population in the United States. And for guys, it's even more striking. They get like about 11 years of extra healthy life expectancy if they are somebody who identifies as a Adventist vegetarian compared to the American population as a whole. So it would work here as well. And I think that's part of the key, is how do we help our patients participate in these types of habits and make a blue zone around us wherever we happen to practice. And a big reason why the people in the blue zones around the world are living so much longer and so much healthier is the stuff that they eat. So they eat things that are like in these pictures here. Lots of whole and minimally processed fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, and beans. Beans are kind of like the foundation of most blue zones cuisine. Might be different beans in Okinawa than it is maybe in Nicoya, Costa Rica, but it's still a lot of these colorful foods, lots of fiber, lots of antioxidants. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, this is kind of the stuff that we're eating. And we start pretty young with our type of junk food like this lollipop. And then as we get older, we move into different types of junk food, like what we see with this pub food here. And along the way, we also do a lot of things like ice cream and pizza, which is one of my own personal nemesises, and things like sugar sweetened beverages. And also those kind of delectable, but very kind of devilish looking cookies that we have here. I can just see them at the nurse's station or something, and they are actually saying to us, I bet you can't just eat one of these. So this is more of the type of diet that we're eating in the United States. So it's probably not surprising. We've kind of turned the nutritional wisdom of the blue zones on its head, and we are eating a lot more of the processed and animal type foods. So much so that if you look at our food consumption as Americans, as a percent of our calories, we get about 63%, so like 2/3 almost of our diet is just kind of processed junk stuff, like added oils and sugars, refined grains, chips and cookies and sugary breakfast cereals, things like that. Another 25% is from animal foods. And then only a very kind of small 12% would be considered coming from plants, like but still not necessarily whole plants, because only half of that would be considered an apple, for example, whereas the other part might be considered apple and apple pie. So really only about 6% of what we're eating as a population would count as the type of food that the blue zones, they're eating about 90% of that type of food. So it's probably not surprising that we see such a difference in our disease rates between the two. But there is some very good news, which is that it doesn't have to be this way. We could definitely make a shift and make a big difference. So this data is from the Global Burden of Disease study back in 2019. And it just basically looked at what would happen if we switched and sort of shifted to an optimal diet, which is something that they defined as more whole grains, more beans, some fish, maybe some fruit, vegetables, nuts, and then decreasing red meat, and especially processed red meats, sugar and sugar-sweetened beverages, and refined grains. So if we went from our typical Western diet, shifted to an optimal diet, at age 20, women are expected to gain over 10 years of healthy life expectancy from that shift. And men, it's 13, so they do even better. Now, if you wait until age 60, which I wouldn't recommend, but if you chose to do that, you would still get over 8 years of additional healthy life expectancy from that shift to an optimal diet. And what really surprised me when this data came out was that even waiting till age 80, you could still gain like almost 3.5 years of healthy life expectancy. So it's not too late for any of us, and we really could shift and make a big difference in our longevity. Now, the largest gains, so if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, best things to do is make sure that you're eating more beans, more whole grains, more nuts, and less red meat and processed meat. So I was very excited when this study came out back in it was 2022 when this came out. Did it as a resident journal club, said, hey, we should definitely make sure that we're all focusing on this. And then the next month, this study came out, which is the bad news. And it was the data from the NHANES study that looked at what is our actual kind of diet quality here for older adults in the United States. They didn't use exactly the same metric. They were using the American Heart Association 2020 strategic impact goals for diet, and they did a different composite score. It is similar though. It basically, you got positive points for fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fish, nuts, and seeds, and beans. And then you got negative points for sugar sweetened beverages, salt, processed meat, and saturated fat. But what they found is that the proportion of older adults with poor diet quality increased from 51% to 61% over the last 17 years or so. The proportion of older adults that had an intermediate diet quality decreased that same amount. You went from 49% to 39%. So people who were intermediate apparently got worse. But the proportion of older adults with ideal diet quality remained very disappointingly, but consistently low at only 0.4%. So we obviously have a lot of work to do, cut out in front of us as far as trying to help our patients and maybe even ourselves and our families shift to a more optimal and health promoting diet. Well, that is about diet, and there's a lot more we could talk about with that. But there are 5 other pillars of lifestyle medicine that are really impactful as well. So let's move on to the exercise one. And I always love this quote from the Earl of Derby that says, those who do not find time for exercise will have to find time for illness. Because I feel like that's the most common complaint that we hear is, oh, I don't have time to exercise. So let's look at what the recommendations are from the National Physical Activity Plan. So if you're trying to meet the recommendations for healthy physical activity, for kids, for young kids, it's mostly just move around throughout the day. For elementary age school kids, it's 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every day, and try to make sure you're getting vigorous at least 3 times a week, as well as some, it's not exactly considered resistance training, but basically things that are using their own body weight to be moving around, like climbing on playground equipment or playing basketball, stuff like that. But then once we get into the adults, so the 18 to 64-year-olds is a little bit more prescriptive. The goal is to get between 150 and 300 minutes of moderate physical activity or 75 minutes of vigorous physical activity every week. Now, activities for resistance training is important too. So a lot of times when people think about physical activity or exercise, they think about the aerobic part. But the resistance training is just as important. So doing things that are either using your own body weight or using hand weights, or you can use things like the resistance bands. Doing that at least twice a week is important, and making sure that you're engaging all the major muscle groups. Now, if you're older than 65, you have all the same requirements as far as aerobic, making sure you get that 150 to 300 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous activity every week, still do the resistance training, but add in multi-component exercises for balance or neuromotor activities. So things like yoga or Tai Chi or dance, things that are able to help you with your proprioception. Because as we all know, falls in that age category are a significant risk. And so doing physical activity that improves your balance and your proprioception is really important. But for everybody, the key is sit less, move more. All the physical activity counts. It doesn't have to be in 10-minute bursts. Like everything that you can do to move around is going to be helpful. So how do you decide, like, what is that aerobic intensity? Like, what is light? What is moderate? One of the ways that you can figure it out is the talk-sing test. And this is really helpful for patients too, because for them, they're also like, how do I know whether this is moderate? Maybe I'm just like strolling here. So the talk-sing test has these categories. If you are going out and doing some exercise, consider that you're going out with a friend maybe. And if you are able to both have a conversation and talk, and you would also be able to sing, like sing a chorus of a song, that's going to be light exercise. If you were going out with your friend and doing that physical activity, and you could still talk and have a conversation, but you would have a hard time singing like through a chorus of a song, that would be moderate. And then if you are having physical activity to the level where you could both not sing and it would be difficult to get an entire sentence out without taking a breath, that would be considered vigorous. So it's a good way that you can test it for yourself. You can ask patients to test it for themselves when they're out doing their physical activity. Use the talk-sing test to be able to figure out, are they in the light, moderate, or vigorous zone? And the power of physical activity is really, I mean, it's truly a wonder drug. It is way, way more powerful than many, if not all, of the things that we can prescribe for patients. So this is some data that looks at all-cause mortality and was looking at how much activity people were doing per week. Now, this is in MET minutes, so that has to do with how long you are doing the activity and how intensely it is. But if you look at people that were doing less than 500 MET minutes per week, so they were not quite meeting the physical activity guidelines, they were less than that, but they were doing something, and they got a 22% reduction in mortality. Now, the 500 to 999 MET minutes per week, that's about meeting in that range of the physical activity guidelines that we talked about. They got a 28% reduction. And then people who were at greater than 1,000 MET minutes per week, they would be exceeding the physical activity guidelines. They got over a third of reduction in mortality. So that's pretty powerful for being able to meet those physical activity guidelines or exceed, and the impact it can have on your health and longevity. But like we said before, resistance training is also very, very important. So resistance training decreases all-cause and cardiovascular mortality independent of the aerobic activity. So, you get benefit from the aerobic activity, but you get additional and separate benefit from doing the resistance training. And it looks like the sweet spot is basically twice a week. You can do more if you want to, but you've kind of plateaued your benefit at that point. So twice a week, and truly just greater than or less than 60 minutes. So basically, if you get up to 60 minutes, that's good. If you want to go more than that, that's fine, but it doesn't seem to really decrease your risk. So theoretically, 30 minutes twice a week, you're all good. And you want to make sure that you are actually using all of your major muscle groups. So resistance training at least twice a week, about 30 minutes each time is perfect. How about steps? We hear a lot about stepping it up and, should you get those 10,000 steps a day? And I mean, 10,000 steps a day is great. That's a great option. But there's some other ways that you can look at it, because it turns out that 10,000 step per day recommendation was originally a marketing slogan. So when they actually looked at from a research standpoint, how many steps a day do you need to do to get different benefit? This is a great study that actually used an accelerometer and looked at middle-aged participants and then followed them for over 10 years. And what they found is that they kind of broke the group into these different categories. So if it was less than 4,000 steps a day, those were considered sedentary, and they were kind of the control group or the comparison group. Then if you were getting between 4,000 and 7,999, that was another group. 8,000 to 11,999. And then the last group was if you're getting greater than 12,000 steps a day. So for people who are getting greater than 8,000 steps a day, they decrease the risk of dying by over 50% compared to people who were getting less than 4,000. And if you could make it up to greater than 12,000 steps per day, you decrease your risk of dying by 65%. So that's pretty impressive amount of benefit for just getting up to above 8,000, or if you can, above 12,000 steps a day. Now, in this particular study, greater step intensity was not associated with lower all-cause mortality after adjusting for the total steps per day. So in this study, like how fast you walked, it didn't matter. But there are other studies that say that maybe step intensity does have an impact. So either way, getting out there and walking is important. And if you can push yourself a little bit more with that toxing test, that would be good too. And like what I like to talk to my patients about is all of these different benefits, because truly, like we said before, if physical activity was a drug, we would all be taking it. If it was a pill, I think we would all want to have these outcomes, which is it's been shown to decrease dementia, decrease your risk of diabetes, breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer. But what a lot of other people don't realize is it also decreases things like depression and anxiety symptoms. So it's a very effective treatment for some mild mood disorders. Decreases your risk of hypertension and heart disease, stroke, AFib, you name it, so much more. I feel like we could have an entire like half-day symposium on just all the good stuff that physical activity does. So it's very, very powerful. And it's a drug that you don't have to worry about how often you take it, and unlimited refills, because it's going to be very, very helpful. All right, so now let's move on to sleep. Now, Matt Walker is a doctor, a PhD, who has done a lot of studying of sleep, and he's got this great book called Why We Sleep. So if you're looking for some interesting reading over the summer, it's a great one that I would recommend. And he talks about sleep this way. He says, amazing breakthrough. Like, can you imagine if we heard this on a late night talk show or some sort of infomercial? Scientists have discovered a revolutionary new treatment that makes you live longer. It enhances your memory, makes you more creative, makes you look more attractive, keeps you slim, and lowers food cravings. It protects you from cancer and dementia, and it wards off colds and the flu. Lowers your risk of heart attack and stroke, not to mention diabetes. You'll even feel happier, less depressed, and less anxious. So are you interested? I think if anybody heard this, they would be like calling us as docs saying, I want to get this pill, I want this prescribed. But it turns out that this is basically what sleep does for us. If we're getting restorative sleep, we get all of those sort of benefits. So how much sleep do we need? The short answer is probably more than most of us are getting. So when you look at, for example, elementary age students, they should be getting between 9 to 11 hours a day. Now, teenagers should still be getting kind of that 8.5 to 9.5 hours a day. And adults, we really still need, most of us, between 7 to 9. If you get below 6 hours a day, that's when you really start to see the risk of things like cancer and heart disease and other things shoot up. But if we don't get enough sleep, this is what happens to us metabolically. It increases our sympathetic mediators, so it kind of jacks up our fight or flight response. It increases our cortisol, and it increases ghrelin, which is a hormone that makes us feel hungry, while also decreasing leptin, which is a hormone that makes us feel full. So it's kind of like a double whammy as far as what sort of things we might be craving. Decreases our growth hormone, and it impairs our glucose tolerance. There was a study that was done at the University of Chicago with some healthy college-age students, and they found that just 3 nights of decreased sleep, where they didn't get into the slow wave sleep, impaired their glucose tolerance so much, it was like the same that you would see when you would gain about 20 to 30 pounds. So it happens pretty quickly when you are not getting enough sleep. It also suppresses our immune system and increases our inflammation. So now let's talk about stress, because that is another big piece of, I think, all of our lives, all of our patients' lives. I always like this quote too, because it says, peace, it does not mean to be in a place where there's no noise, trouble, or hard work. It means to be in the midst of those things and still be calm in your heart. And I think that's the crux of it. I mean, it's going to be impossible for us to not have stress, for our patients to not have stress. I mean, I'd probably be kind of boring. There wouldn't be a whole lot that we would be doing. We'd just sort of be lying around, not really doing much. But the problem is when stress becomes so much that it is impeding our function or our ability to enjoy life. Like, a little bit of stress is good. It kind of pushes us to try new things or to accomplish things. But when stress becomes overwhelming, that's when it's important that we take a step back and say, okay, how can we manage this in a healthy way? And we know that the effect of stress is pretty serious. You get a lot of metabolic changes. So again, just like sleep deprivation, effects of stress can be increasing your fight or flight response. So your sympathetic mediators go up, your parasympathetic mediators go down. So you're losing that whole, or decreasing that rest and digest and recover sort of part of our system. And it suppresses our immune system. So we're more likely to get those colds or flus, or potentially more at risk for cancer. And chronic stress also increases cortisol, just like we said with the sleep deprivation, which increases our fat deposition, especially in places we don't want it, like in the visceral fat area. It increases appetite, makes us more hungry, we're craving things. And when we crave that, it's usually things like carbohydrates and fat. So it can definitely lead to weight gain. It also does a lot of things as far as increasing our chronic disease risk. So for things like depression and anxiety, heart disease, if people have HIV, it's been shown to accelerate the progression of it, increases your risk of diabetes, and also jacks up a lot of the inflammatory mediators, which, as we know, we want to be decreasing our chronic inflammation because that increases our risk of a bunch of different chronic diseases. Luckily, though, we also now have some data that shows that mind-body techniques really work. You know, it's not just a touchy-feely sort of thing. There's actual metabolic evidence that if you're doing, and this is the key, because everybody's stress reduction or stress management techniques are different. It's not the same as with physical activity where there's a guideline that everybody should follow. What you do to help relieve stress is very individualized. So when I'm talking to my residents or my patients, I say it's really finding things that you want to do, not just things that you have to do. And if you're finding things like that, it could be yoga, it could be meditation, could be nature therapy, just being outside, or reading a book that's just for pleasure, or doing a craft or anything like that, playing music. But when you are engaged in these types of techniques, you can enter the state of what people call flow, where time just passes, you don't even realize it. And in these types of activities, you can increase your vagal tone. So you are now improving your parasympathetic response and getting a little bit of that rest, digest, and recover. It'll decrease the sympathetic mediators and even decrease your blood pressure, as well as improving heart rate variability, which is an important kind of indicator of resilience. It can put your cortisol level lower. It can downregulate some of these inflammatory mediators like nuclear factor kappa B, and decrease rumination, which is, I think, an interesting one, because rumination is, I kind of think of it as like picking at a scab. There's something that bugged you, something that was upsetting, and you just can't stop thinking about it, even though the thing isn't happening anymore. And it may not be helpful to be continually like thinking about it and getting yourself stressed out. Rumination is a very common response to an unpleasant stimuli. And things like mind-body techniques can decrease that rumination and improve your coping strategies by shifting something that you think of maybe initially as a threat to something that you would think of as a challenge. This threat makes us kind of go into the whole fight or flight mode, whereas challenge, we react to that differently as a from a metabolic standpoint. And social connection is very important as well. That can be part of your stress management. And it's also a separate, pillar in lifestyle medicine, because it is such an important, has such an important impact on our longevity and our quality of life. So the Harvard Health Study, which is the longest study of happiness ever undertaken, and there was a new book that just came out this year called The Good Life with Dr. Robert Waldinger, who's the current executive director of this study. But the Harvard Health Study looked at how did things go for a group of men from Harvard as undergrads compared to a control group of men in Boston that were of a different socioeconomic group, more of a blue collar, living in the area around Harvard. And they followed these men for many, many years, their whole lives, basically, and did a lot of questionnaires and did blood work. And what they were really trying to see is what components of a life make a happy life and also a long life, hopefully free from disease. And surprisingly to them, and also I think to a lot of us that trained in medicine many years ago, it turned out that the quality of these participants' relationships was the thing that was most important. Once you got to the point where you had enough financial resources to be kind of like stable, you could meet your needs as far as food and housing and healthcare. Once you got to that basic level, more wealth or status or power was not the key in figuring out how long you're going to live or how happy you're going to be. It's the strength of the relationships. So just going to Harvard did not necessarily mean that you were going to live a long, happy life. The men in Boston who had very strong social connections, even though they had lower educational attainment and usually lower financial success, they often would have longer lives and increased happiness. So that's another great book to look at, The Good Life. And as another thing for us to think about as clinicians is that loneliness is really a modifiable risk factor. And it's something we can ask our patients about and something that we can help them find some opportunities to change as far as loneliness is concerned. So there was a study called the Health and Retirement Study, and it looked at older adults, asked them 3 questions. It said, do you feel left out? Do you feel lack of companionship? Are you lonely? And if you said yes to any of those, you were classified as lonely. Interestingly, over 40% of the respondents were classified as lonely. They did say yes to one of those things, even though a lot of them lived with another person. So just because you are living with someone else does not necessarily mean that you are feeling like you've got a support group. But for the people that said yes and were qualified as lonely in this study, they found that those people had a decline in their activity of daily living over the course of the study, about 8 years, decreased mobility. They started to have more trouble with climbing stairs and doing upper extremity tasks. But most concerning is loneliness. If you were diagnosed in a way with being lonely, that increased the risk of death by like 60% compared to people who were saying that no, they did have a support group. Okay, so all these pillars sound great, right? But does it really work in the real world? And that's the key. So Ford et al. Did a great study a while ago that looked at lifestyle habits of over 23,000 participants, and they followed them up over time. And really, they were just looking at 4 things that are relatively simple, maybe not easy to achieve in our society, but they were just looking at, did the people have a BMI less than 30? So they could be overweight, but not obese. Did they smoke? How much physical activity that were they doing? So were they getting at least 3.5 hours per week, only 30 minutes per day? And what was their diet quality? So did they have a high intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and lower red meat consumption? So definitely not vegan, not even vegetarian, but more of a plant predominant or plant slant diet. And what they found is if you could say yes to all 4 of those things, weight is in a pretty healthy range, not smoking, getting enough physical activity, eating a plant predominant slant diet, you had a decreased risk of 78% for developing any chronic disease, really, compared to somebody who said, no, I can't say yes to any of those things, which is really pretty amazing when you think about it. To decrease your risk of chronic disease by that amount is pretty much impossible with any of the other medical opportunities that we have with medications or procedures, but lifestyle can give that type of result. So when I first saw this study, I was excited again. I was like, this is great because, this is like a longevity jackpot for everybody. We should be able to do this. And so then I looked at a study which says what percentage of Americans can say yes to all 4 of these things. So I cannot see all of you guys, but I want you to think in your brain, how much? What do you think? What is the percentage? And it turns out to be 2.7%, according to NHANES data. So only 2.7% of Americans can say yes to all 4 of those things. And that probably is a big reason why we spend so much on healthcare, and yet our outcomes are kind of at the bottom of our reference countries. The American Heart Association has something similar. They call it the Simple 7. And they just basically say, okay, if you can say that you're not a smoker, you're eating a healthy diet, you're physically active, you've got a healthy body weight, you're managing your blood pressure. So that could even be with medication, controlling cholesterol, again, with medication, you could be reducing your blood sugar. If you can say yes to even just 3 of those things, it decreases your risk of heart disease by 50%. But only 1% of Americans have ideal numbers for all 7. And I think the American Heart Association is coming on board with lifestyle medicine too, because they just changed it to be a couple years ago to be the essential 8 instead of the simple 7, because they added in getting healthy sleep. So this brings us, as we're wrapping up, to the concept of therapeutic dose, because lifestyle change is fabulous. But if you are just basically asking people to, get a little bit more exercise or eat a little bit more fruits and vegetables, a lot of times that's not as effective. And a lot of docs that I've talked to over the years have said, yeah, I know that this stuff will work, but my patients just won't do it. And what I have often thought about is, well, let's think about therapeutic dose for lifestyle change in the same way that we think about it for medication. Because if you had a patient that came into the ER in congestive heart failure, and the pulse ox was like 86% or something, and they were dyspneic, and you said, okay, I'm going to give you Lasix. I'm going to take 10 milligrams of Lasix and rub it on your skin. We know that wouldn't work. And it's not because Lasix doesn't work for congestive heart failure. It's because it wasn't a high enough dose. It wasn't given through the right route. You'd probably need a couple doses over time. Same thing with lifestyle change. It's helpful to give people short counseling information, but it's also important to have frequent follow-up and more intensive kind of interventions. So here's a good example of an intensive intervention. This is a diabetes prevention program. It's a randomized control study. And what they did is they took people who had impaired glucose tolerance, so they were in that pre-diabetes range, broke them into 3 groups. One group, which is the placebo, had standard of care, basically saying, hey, you should exercise more, you should watch your carbohydrates, try to lose some weight, and they were following them over time. The end goal of this study was to see how long it would take or what percentage of people would progress to actual type 2 diabetes during the study time. So then the next group is the metformin group. That group was given 850 milligrams of metformin twice a day. So pretty decent amount of metformin. And then the other group, the third group, was the lifestyle group. And they were enrolled in a pretty intensive program where over the course of the year, they had multiple sessions where they were taught about healthier eating, encouraged to lose about 7% of their body weight. They were encouraged to exercise at least 150 minutes per week. And they followed these groups over the course of time to see how many of them developed diabetes. And the metformin group, it definitely worked. I mean, metformin worked without question. They had a 31% decrease in the risk of going from going from pre-diabetes to actual diabetes. But the lifestyle group was even more effective, almost twice as much. So 58% decreased risk. So this was so effective that the study that was supposed to last 5 years only lasted 4 years because the ethics group that was doing the review said it was unethical to continue this study when lifestyle was so much more effective. So given at the appropriate therapeutic dose, we can see a huge difference as far as the impact on our patients. This is not a randomized trial, but it gives another kind of insight into what can happen even for people who've had diabetes for a while. So this was a one-arm intervention group where they took 20 men who had type 2 diabetes for several years. They were already on insulin, and they actually hospitalized them so that they could control all the food that they were eating. And these men were fed a very high carbohydrate, high fiber diet, so kind of like a whole food plant-based diet that was weight maintaining, meaning that they were weighed every morning. And if they actually lost weight, they were forced to eat even more of the food, like more salad and more potatoes and all that good stuff. And they followed these men for 16 days. And what they found is over the 16 days that they were in the hospital, because the goal was to see what does the quality of food, what is the impact of that? Like, we know weight loss improves blood sugar control, but what about if you just change what they're eating and they don't lose weight? And over 16 days, the overall insulin requirements of the group decreased by 60%, and over half of them were able to stop their insulin entirely, despite the fact that they had been on it for a while. Their serum cholesterol also dropped an average of almost 80 points. So I think of this as being the power of plants. And I know it's a small study. It'd be great if we could replicate more and more of these types of studies, because this particular study was done in 1979 when I was 8 years old. So I think it's time for us to start doing a little bit more of this type of research. And Kevin Hall's group down in DC is doing a lot of good research similar to this. Now, this is a randomized control study. This is Neil Barnard's group with PCRM down in DC, and they did a randomized control trial of patients who were, they already had diabetes, but they were living out in the community. The food was not provided. The only thing that was done was regular educational counseling appointments, talking about either what they call a vegan diet, which would be a healthy whole food plant-based diet, or the American Diabetes Association diet. So both of these diets are better than the standard American diet. But what they found over the 74-week trial period is that the people who were eating the whole food plant-based diet lost more weight. They also had a bigger change in their hemoglobin A1C. They dropped more. Their total cholesterol dropped a lot more, and so did their LDL. So this is a kind of like a testament to the fact that people can do this when they're living on their own and the food's not being provided for them, as long as they're getting enough support to maintain the changes. So how about heart disease? That was diabetes. So heart disease is also very amenable to lifestyle change. And this is the work of Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who is out at the Cleveland Clinic. And it looks at patients who were, this actually doesn't have any physical activity or any part of it, just a dietary change. And he prescribed a very low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet for patients who basically had such end-stage heart disease that they had run out of plumbing. They were told that medical management was the only thing that they could do because they'd already had all the stents and everything that they could, or bypasses. And Dr. Esselstyn took these patients and would see them every 2 weeks and really emphasized a diet of eating a lot of dark green leafy vegetables, lots of fruit and whole grains and colorful vegetables. And what he found was really amazing as far as their improvement in their angina symptoms. So here, this PET scan, you can see one of his patients had a lot of decreased blood flow here. And then down here, same patient, it's improving dramatically. And you would think that this would take a long time, but the difference between this PET scan and this PET scan was only 3 weeks. And the main difference that we've learned since then is that the endothelium starts to recover and is more able to dilate and be able to do blood flow. Now, it takes a lot longer for the actual plaques to resolve, but that's what happened over here. This is a left anterior descending of one of the patients that work with Dr. Esselstyn. And you can see how kind of blocked up this one is. But this is the same patient here. Now, this took 32 months, but it does show that you can actually reverse some of the damage that happens with heart disease. A lot of people think, well, are people going to stick with it? And Dr. Esselstyn showed that for his participants, they did, because they were feeling so much better and they had the ongoing support of being as part of his program. Because if they stopped with the dietary therapy, he just basically said, okay, we understand, but he stopped seeing them as regular patients. And after, in this study, after 3.7 years, 89% of his patients were still adherent to the dietary therapy. A different cohort that he had actually had 77% that were adherent after 12 years. Now, this is Dean Ornish. He actually did a randomized control study that looked at the change in diameter coronary artery stenosis. So he had a control group, which were people that had heart disease and were under the standard of care and doing the things that you would usually do. And then he had an intervention group where he really focused on, for him, it's food, which he says as eat well, again, a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. But he also puts in things like physical activity and stress management and social connection. So he likes to say, eat well, move more, stress less, love more. And he followed this group over 5 years, looking at the coronary artery stenosis that they could see on angiogram. And what they found is that the control group, which was doing the standard of care that their cardiologist would normally do, had a 10% or more increase in their coronary artery stenosis over time, which is pretty typical because we know it's a progressive disease. But the intervention group had a 3.4% decrease in their coronary artery stenosis. So they were resorbing their plaque, they were getting better. And overall, between the two groups, there was a 14% difference in arterial stenosis, which makes a huge difference in blood flow because, you know, like the rate of flow of something through a hollow tube is 1 over the radius to the 4th. And if you make a difference in the radius, it's going to make a big difference as far as the blood flow. So to wrap things up, how should we advise our patients and ourselves to live like a centenarian? One is to eat a predominantly whole food, plant-based diet. Doesn't mean you have to be completely no animal products at all, but make sure you're getting a lot of colorful fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, and nuts and seeds on your plate. Enjoy frequent physical activity. Doesn't have to be like what we think of as exercise. It's moving around during the day, using lifestyle activities, you know, gardening or going for a walk or, you know, anything that's getting you up and moving. And then prioritizing restorative sleep. It's so important for our hormones and for our cortisol levels, our inflammation, all that stuff. Nurturing our social connections, engaging in healthy stress management activities, and then avoiding risky substances like tobacco and excessive alcohol. And I'm going to add one more here, which is honor your ikigai. Ikigai is a saying in the Okinawan Blue Zone, which is all about what's your purpose? Like, why do you wake up in the morning? What excites you about life? And it's really important for us, all of us, as far as our longevity and our quality of life, to honor our ikigai and not say, oh, when I have time, I will do that, but to be able to make the time as part of your journey to be able to honor that ikigai. So these are our 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of you and we can have some discussion. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Grega. If people want to come on camera, that's great. And you can all either use the chat to enter any questions you have. I'm getting a thumbs up from Dr. Rich.
Thank you.
or, or unmute to ask any questions. We just have a few minutes, but please go ahead.
Any questions would be great, or just comments.
Hi, I'm Sulabha. I'm driving, so I really can't turn on my camera, but I just wanted to say it's a fantastic talk and thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you. I really, really appreciate that. And I would be happy to, connect with any of you and talk about this stuff, because this was an overview of lifestyle medicine. But another really important piece that we didn't have time to get into today is, okay, great, this is wonderful, but how do we actually do this with our patients in the clinic? And like, what are some of the ways to implement that? So if we ever want to do another one, let me know, Liz. And if any of you guys want to be in touch, I'd be happy to talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually from Idaho State University, and we are actually starting our lifestyle medicine clinics next Thursday. So I'm really excited to share that as well.
That's fabulous. Congratulations. I hope maybe some of you guys will come to the American College of Lifestyle Medicine annual meeting sometime. I'm a conference chair for this year. I will be for next year as well. And there's a whole bunch of really good speakers coming in. Lots of great networking. I always feel like energized by the tribe after we go to one of those conferences, because I think that everybody's really trying to implement this stuff in their own life and with their patients. So there's a lot of good energy.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions, Dr. Rich or Dr. Bowman?
Great job.
Thank you.
I find it super difficult to convince people. I can talk to them about pillars, and I can talk to people about what they should be doing, and they nod and then they go home and don't do it. So it's hard to move people off their Easters and off their happy places, and most of them aren't happy. And so that's the most difficult part, is figuring the sweet spot of how to motivate people.
Agreed. And who's their support person, right? Like, who else can you kind of bring into that to help, if you can, as far as like a spouse or a child or somebody, even if it's food is often one of the most difficult ones, I think. A lot of times I'll talk to patients about which of these things do you think you might be able to start with, and things like physical activity or sleep are often more the ones that people are like, oh, I might be able to start walking 10 minutes 5 times a week, and then if after you get the wins, sometimes then they're ready to move forward. But one of the other things I like to do is give people homework, and so give them a TED Talk or a movie to watch or a suggestion, and then have them watch that and then come back and talk to me and just ask them, hey, what did that mean to you? Like, did anything surprise you? Anything that you're interested in? And I've had more success sometimes for people after they've seen some of those movies or TED Talks to be like, oh, maybe this would be a really good thing. A lot of times if they watch it with their support groups as well, like their husbands or their wives or children, then they're sometimes ready. And then sometimes they're not. So I agree with you. That's the biggest challenge.
You have a list of these TED Talks or movies that
Yes. So Liz, I will send it to you, because we did that for Illinois. Basically, I have a list of videos, TED Talks, websites, books. So, and depending on the patient, I don't give them all of it, because that's kind of like overwhelming. I give them what I think is going to be most impactful to them.
And then we should watch them so we can benefit ourselves.
Yeah. Well, some people, if they're this sometimes is not easy if you're in a big health system, but in people who have more of smaller offices or more control over what's going on in their office, some people have them on like some of the TED Talks going in the waiting room, so it's just something that people can watch as they're waiting. Or I don't know if you guys have, some people have those, ours are yellow, the little pads that people check in on, like iPad sort of thing. You can have that and they can be watching that while they're sitting and waiting in the office too.
I find most difficult is a lot of patients, we are their support group.
Yes.
Support groups at home, they come in just for I'm the highlight of their day.
Yes.
And they have nothing at home to try to motivate them. So that's one of the that I find most other or the who they live with, their support group is
Mhm.
actually their damage group. So
Yes.
who's to say people can want to stop smoking, but if their spouse or their significant other or their roommates are smoking or not
Mhm.
even that, it's hard to.
Agreed. Have you guys tried doing shared medical appointments at all? Because I know that's one of the ways that that we do with Kellen Foundation to try, it doesn't always, there's a lot of barriers as far as what you were just talking about, if you're people at home or your damage group instead of your support group. But doing shared medical appointments has been a way for us to help people find others that are supportive. And like you said, they're coming in like it's the highlight of their day to see you. So if you actually had an hour and a half to spend with 10 of them, they're really excited to spend that time with their doctor and talk amongst each other. And so like one of the things our group is doing next week is I have given them the assignment, and I think they're in about 6 sessions into our shared medical appointment curriculum that we do. And so they've got enough information now where I gave them the assignment that each of them is supposed to make some form of whole food, plant-based, either entree or snack or something, and take a picture of it and send the recipe in and the picture. And we're putting together a PowerPoint of everybody's so that then as the group visit goes on, we'll go looking through all of those things. People can talk about what they thought, did it taste good? What would they change anything? And then I will send the PowerPoint as a PDF to everybody so that they got all these other recipes that they talked about. So that kind of gets people excited.
That's great. We did shared medical appointments with the residents, some at the Federal Residency in Boise, and we did share medical appointments for pregnancy.
Oh, yeah.
That worked for a little while, and then kind of the interest died down, and we couldn't get enough women
Mhm.
same trimester to be together, and so but that worked out really well. We have a couple of dietitians that have done that's for people for healthy eating, and so they've done that, but we need to that's shared medical appointments is instead figuring out how
Mhm. Logistics.
going to look into that a little bit more. So thank you.
Absolutely. Dr. Bowman, did you want to say something?
Oh, I just really appreciated your presentation. I agree with everything stated there about how it feels like there's still a large gap. The information you presented, as you know, a lot of it has been around for a while. So it is interesting to me how practitioners who focus on the lifestyle are more of a unicorn in the system currently than there is what I would say like systems that are designed either at the residency or at Terry Riley or at St. Al's or St. Luke's to deliver this quality of care, which is just, it's interesting. I do think the likelihood of any of these unicorns, making dramatic changes on a population level seems pretty low, because you're really swimming upstream. So I've wondered for myself if working with the medical staff, for staff wellness, how are we doing as a medical staff to care for ourselves when we know this data? Are we getting enough steps? Are we eating right? Are we sleeping right?
Mhm.
What are the relationships like, and so forth? Because I think that when we as the healthcare providers really embrace this and confront the reality of the culture that we live in is not necessarily aligned to help us produce healthy lifestyles. Once we confront that in ourselves, I think we'll be more likely to help produce that sort of change on a systems level. And in the meantime, I'm one of those unicorns, like you say, just trying to do it on an individual basis. It's been more rewarding in clinical practice because I feel like I'm doing something that's more true and uh, right. But it does feel like we're not going to get the type of population-based improvements that we're hoping for. So, yeah, I really appreciated your message. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is an excellent point that you made. It's like we can do it on an individual level, and that's very helpful for that individual. But when you look at the bigger picture from a population standpoint, that's why the blue zones do so well. It's like the social norms that are around the people. So how can we support or change to that here? And to your point about getting the leadership, the doctors, the nurses, the dietitians, whoever is the kind of the healthcare leaders through this type of a program, something where they are learning some of this information is really helpful. I think I'm looking at a potential cohort for that for next year, because it seems like for us here in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, I started Kellen Foundation in 2007. So it's been a while, and we've been doing things like, you start where you are and you work your way out, but it's gotten to the point where I think enough people in the healthcare world are interested. So there's the potential for some of the executives in one of our health systems he wants to go through the type of program that we're doing. But on a different, like more population level, we've already done these types of shared medical appointment things, which were done for an employer group that was the school district. So it was like the teachers and the principals and the front desk, the administrators. It's been we've done 2 cohorts so far, and there's going to be 2 more in the coming year. That really does seem to be moving the needle for the schools, because we're already in the schools teaching the kids. Well, Kellen Foundation does school programs as well. So we're already teaching the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, but now it's also coming down from the teachers and the principals.
Right.
And they work together. So they're able to do like walking things after school, or they're texting each other pictures of what they bring in for lunch, like they're becoming their own support system. So I think your idea is a good one. If there's a way to interact with a group of the decision makers or the leaders, then they start to percolate it out as well.
Yeah, I had a strategy to get there, although we were never able to deploy it quite satisfactorily. But we had a community health center retreat, a CME retreat, and the medical staff were able to attend the CE and get credit and what have you. But it was a family event, and one of the CE events, we actually had a CE for the kids, basically, and the kids could get the CE certificate just like their parent had gotten, sign out, hour of credit for listening to and the topic was nutritional stuff. So what we were trying to do is build this awareness on sort of a family level. And you know how it goes. The spouse is usually the one, at least in our household, that says, gosh, are you taking care of yourself? I don't know that you're getting enough steps. And that sort of lateral support from loved ones, I think, is much more likely to have a lasting impact than what they hear from me in the doctor's office. I agree with Kevin. We see people that very much appreciate that social interaction in the office, but you're going to get 20 minutes in 3 months, where if they've got a loved one that's harping on them about quitting smoking or what have you, that's more, seems like there's some opportunity there.
I agree with that 100%. That just made me laugh because I'm married and I have 2 children. One of them is 23 and one of them is 26. And I've been doing this lifestyle medicine stuff for most of my children's life, not all of it, but they're old enough now that when I'm doing something, my daughter specifically will be like, Mom, is that a lifestyle medicine choice?
Right.
Accountable. Kids do that.
Yeah, that's right.
Hold us accountable, which is great. So
yeah.
that's
and now grandkids are doing it to me. So.
I'll look forward to that. I will definitely look forward to that.
You got 2 levels.
Yes, and then they're getting you on both sides, I tell you. So one of the things that we do with our group visits is we encourage people to bring a spouse or a support person, so a child or a spouse, so that even though they're not part of the visit, like they don't have you don't write anything about them, but they are, and we don't bill anything about them, but they are included.
Mhm.
So that has been very helpful as well. The other thing that's very helpful for us is we always provide some food, and that is challenging. I know from a financial standpoint, how you're going to do that, but so that people are tasting some of the stuff that we're suggesting, as opposed to just saying, here's a recipe, hope you like it.
Yeah, that's a good
I thought you
idea.
were gonna say pizza, you bring pizza, that's the food, right?
No, exactly. But things like chia seed pudding or hummus and whole grain like Triscuits, or like stuff that people are not used to seeing. And then we go through the nutrition label reading stuff of I just finished a group visit tonight, actually, before I got on with this, and we were going over chocolate chia seed pudding. And so then we said, okay, for the recipe, because everybody got a chance to eat the pudding. And then for the recipe, we went through, okay, from last week, because last week's when we did nutrition labels. We said, okay, what do we need to look at? Here's the calories. Okay, how many grams of carbohydrate? How many grams of fiber? How do you guys feel about that? Is this a good choice or not a good choice? So it's like an interactive. Kevin, do you like chia seed pudding? I don't know. You had that look on your face like, I don't know. Oh, you should try this stuff. It is good. It actually has more nutrition in it than most people's lunch, and it's only like one serving. It's got almost 5 grams of protein. It's got almost no sodium, but it's got good potassium. It's got over 8 grams of fiber. It's good stuff.
Crunchy yogurt, granola works for that, but I don't know about chia seeds.
Yeah. More protein, more omega-3s.
Yogurt, that's where I get my protein.
There you go. Well, Liz, if I send you the list of all the things I recommend, I don't know, can you put it up even as a web page for you guys? Or I don't know, that I know when we did it with Illinois, they made a web page on their IAFP thing so that they could just direct people to that. I don't know if that's possible though.
Now, what I'll probably do is send both the recording and the resource list you mentioned to everybody who registered for tonight's talk. And then I think Brittany and I will work on a lifestyle medicine page on the website sometime in the future, and we'll house it there. So yeah, if you just want to email it to me, I'll make sure to get it out to all registrants as well as the attendees tonight.
Sounds good. Well, it was a pleasure meeting all of you guys. Good luck.
Thank you.
Try to create blue zones where you live.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for being here. Thank you, Dr. Grega. You'll look for your CME certificate in the next couple of weeks. Appreciate everybody's time. Hope you'll join us again on August 24th for our next fall evening CME, and I'll be following up with more details on that over email. Thanks everyone for your time. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you, Gavin. Yeah.
Yeah.